Jesus is risen. You crushed the power of hell. Yeah, wash over us. Bring your glory down. Come fill your people with revival sound. Oh, rain down your fire. Come ignite our hearts. May we burn for you, Lord, like a million stars. Like a million stars. Whoa, whoa. We see you moving. You're bringing your kingdom. Your power is rising. Yeah, your church is alive. Wash over us. Bring your glory down. Come fill your people with revival sound.
All right, good evening. I appreciate you being here. We are in the middle of our teaching series from the foundational chapters, Genesis 1 through 11, and we're also in the middle of the drama of the flood. I was given this a number of years ago, and I've saved it. It's a top 10 list entitled, All I Really Needed to Know I Learned from Noah's Ark. So here's some, we might as well jump right to the application, okay? Number one, plan ahead. It wasn't raining when Noah built the ark. Number two, stay fit. When you're 600 years old, someone might ask you to do something really big. Number three, don't listen to critics. Do what has to be done. Number four, build on high ground. Number five, for safety's sake, travel in pairs. Number six, stay below decks during a storm. Number seven, remember that the ark was built by amateurs and the Titanic was built by professionals. Number eight, remember that the woodpeckers inside are often a bigger threat than the storm outside. Number nine, don't miss the boat. And number 10, no matter how bleak it looks, there's always a rainbow on the other side. We're in the middle of this discussion of the ark, and you'll remember that even though the story of the ark covers the better part of 3 chapters, it's still an extended parenthesis because in the overarching story, we are still in the story of the line of Seth. Because what's happening here is God has taken a sidebar to tell us about this moment of dramatic and global judgment, but it's in the context of His perfect unfolding of His promise from all the way back in Genesis chapter 3 that He would secure a solution to the problem of sin. So we can get caught up in the flood, but I don't want you to lose sight of the point of what's happening, because we've now come over here and we've got this extended sidebar, this parenthesis, and it's fascinating, and it tells us there are a lot of lessons there, but the point is that God is doing what He said He would do. And the only difference in these foundational chapters is that the time span of the early chapters of Genesis is really equivalent to the time span of the whole rest of the Old Testament, which is equivalent in a sense to the time span of the New Testament all the way to today. So it's brief, it's by definition a summary, but it covers these foundations. And what's important, remember, is that in these early chapters, we have an introductory preview of every major doctrine that the Bible is going to then unfold for us. So, frankly, part of the dilemma of the church in our generation is that because we're embarrassed by stories like the flood, we have trivialized these opening chapters, and in doing so, we've undercut the credibility of everything else in the Word of God. So when somebody says, well, I believe the Bible, but you know, those early chapters, those are just mythological stories. Okay, run from that teacher, because he has just given away the foundation. These chapters cover vast amounts of time, and they are an overview from 30,000 feet. Whereas we start with, in chapter 12, we start with Abraham, and we begin to zoom in, and the story begins to take on more detail, where we see the development of God's promises through individual personalities. So the Bible is going to zoom in, and we're going to be much closer. But that doesn't mean that the 30,000-foot view of the early chapters is in any way lesser or wrong. It's just different. It sets the stage for the detail that God wants us to know. But it is not to be treated like, as I've said before, like just so stories. In Genesis chapter 8, picking up where we left off, you see the outline that I've given you, exchanging gifts. It may seem strange to you to call this the gift of the flood. But I want you to understand that from the perspective of Noah. All right, let me frame it this way. Last Sunday I taught from the parable of the wheat and the weeds. And I said one of the reasons that Jesus explains the ongoing presence of evil is because a patient God is willing to tolerate evil to a point so as not to do damage to his own children who are inevitably intertwined in the realities of the world in which we live. Okay, but when we are in the Old Testament and we look at the Noah story, we have to understand that as bad as we think things are today, there is no place in the Bible that speaks like the days of Noah as far as being utterly wicked and evil to the extreme. So when we say the gift of the flood, what I mean by that is, from Noah's perspective, as devastating as this global cataclysm was, Noah understood, because of the remarkable perspective that he was allowed to have by really understanding what God was doing. God revealed his purposes. Noah saw the flood as a gift because in his generation, the choice wasn't wheat and weeds being confused. The choice was we were down to 8 righteous people. And the gift of the flood was God saying, I will preserve righteousness so that the drama of redemption is never compromised, even at the expense of the whole world. So in a very real sense, as devastating as this event certainly was, it was a gift to Noah, who understood that to live with those 8 people and in a sense begin to repopulate the earth, that was a fresh start. Imagine he's lived, 600 years in the most wicked period of human history since creation. The flood was a gift. It was a gift to the righteous, even though they were truly a tiny remnant. Let me pull my phone out because I've got something I want to read to you in just a minute. So, Let me read some of this chapter. Let me read this chapter, and then we'll come back. And you see me, I've put actual cataclysm and foundational truth. And we're going to talk about the flood. But I'm going to just sort of throw some things out because, number one, we started this series by saying it's important to see what the text tells us, and it's important to understand what the text does not tell us. So I'm going to throw out some things that you, at your leisure, could look up and do some research because what I'm going to suggest is when properly understood apart from an evolutionary narrative, which is the dominant storyline of our generation scientifically, if you can set evolution aside because of its outrageous inconsistencies and statistical impossibilities, and you look at the way to take the geological and fossil evidence and examine it apart from this narrative that has been imposed, there are lots of things that provide reasonable and rational support for the idea of a global deluge. But the text is not overly concerned with that. So I don't want us to be overly concerned with it in this setting. So I'm going to throw some things out that you can look up, that you can go explore. But understand the Bible, it strikes me odd that one of the criticisms of the Bible is, well, you would think something like a global flood, God would prove that with a little more information. Why would you think that? I mean, once you've accepted the statement, in the beginning God created, what else is there to worry about? I mean, the geological possibilities of a global cataclysm are nothing once you've accepted that God spoke and from nothing there was something. See, that's the problem. That's the basic problem of evolutionary theory, because what's happened is we've fallen victim to an interesting rational trick with evolution. What they've done is they've argued that time, that massive amounts of time, that billions of years of time allows for this statistical possibility of change from single cell organisms, blah, blah, blah. Well, two things to consider about evolution, and we'll get to the text. But here's the thing. We see today single cellular life made up of a single cell. What we do not see anywhere on the planet is life that's made up of 2 cells, or life that's made up of 3 cells. What we see is there is a leap from single cellular life. There is also, parallel to that, increasingly complex life. But we see no evidence of a movement from the simple to the complex. There's no evidence for that. Now what happens is you go to a chemist and you say, listen, I'm trying to understand evolution. Can you explain it to me? And the chemist will say this, well, we don't have it all worked out in chemistry, but go talk to the biologist because they've got it worked out. So you go to the biologist and he says, and you say, I want you to explain evolution to me. And he goes, well, we've got the theory, but we don't have all the details worked out in the field of biology. But if you go talk to the zoologist, they've got it worked out. You go to the zoologist and you say, hey, listen, I'm trying to understand the theory of evolution. Can you help me? And he goes, we don't have it all worked out in our field, but if you'll go talk to the chemist, he'll tell you. See, everybody thinks that they're just behind. They just haven't worked out all the kinks, but then in all the other areas, it's worked out because what's presented in scientific journals and papers that actually are provided by funding is the appearance that it's all worked out. It's not. If you want to examine this and you say, but I am not a scientist, I can't do that. Let me recommend a book to you by a man named Philip Johnson. It's called Darwin on Trial. What is so fascinating about that book is that Philip Johnson is not a scientist, he's a lawyer. And he takes the theory of evolution and dismantles it from a logical examination, not a scientific examination. In other words, he shows that it's logically impossible for the theory to hold up. But here's where the trick comes in. Because they've extended this to now, the latest estimates are somewhere in the range of 16 billion years. Now, I believe in an old Earth, but I don't necessarily believe in a 16 billion year Earth. But what happens is they keep adding time, because the more complexity we discover, the more time you have to have for the simple to become complex. So they keep adding time to the time frame. But here's where the trick comes in. They started with, 500,000 years, and now we're up to 16 billion years, but they've missed the whole point. Because I don't care how much time you add to this theoretical process of transition from a single cell to something more complex. Here's the question that never gets answered. How does something come from nothing? In other words, how does life come from non-life? Well, there was this primordial soup, and it had all of these chemical elements, and there was a lightning strike, and it energized. Does that not sound like the plot of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? It's an unreproducible theory, and the scientific method traditionally in Western civilization is founded on the principle that a theory has to be measurable so that it can be reproducible. And if the theory can't be replicated or reproduced, then you tinker with the theory. This cannot be reproduced. But we ignore the question of nothing to something, of non-life to life, and we fade into this trick that, well, the slowness of time has solved the problem. Let me ask you this question. If God did a miracle of healing, and he does that, but if God did a miracle of healing, and that miracle, you went to bed one night sick or injured in some way, and you woke up the next morning and you were completely healed, would it be any less of a miracle if you went to bed one night and 10 days later you discovered that you were completely healed? You see, a quick miracle and a slow miracle, at their essence, they're both still miracles. What we've done here is they've tricked us to ignore the fundamental questions, and they've just made the whole process incredibly slow, as though a slow process will convince us that it could really happen this way. No. All right, Genesis chapter 8. But God remembered Noah and all the animals and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. Also the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained, and the water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days the water decreased. Then in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, notice again, we talked about this last week, this is not a mythological story because there is such historical precision in the telling of it. You read the Aeneid or the Iliad or the Odyssey, you read the stories of Greek mythology or Norse mythology, guess what you don't have? Historical time references. That's why fairy tales always start with once upon a time. They never start with in January of 1868. Verse 5. The water decreased steadily until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. Then it came about at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made, and he sent out a raven, and it flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water was low on the surface of the land. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of its foot, so it returned to him in the ark, for the water was on the surface of all the earth. Then he put out his hand and took it and brought it into the ark to himself. So he waited another 7 days longer, and again he sent out the dove from the ark, and the dove came to him in the evening, and behold, in its beak was a fresh olive leaf. So Noah knew that the water was low on the earth. Then he waited another 7 days longer, and sent out the dove, but it did not return to him again. Now it came about in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first of the month, that the water was dried up from the earth. Now, if you do the math on those historical references, just as a side note, Noah was confined to the ark. Now, the actual flood was 150 days, which is essentially 5 months. But he was confined to the ark for 1 year and 10 days. All right? The water was dried up on the earth. Then Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground had dried up. Now, we're going to finish this chapter, but this is, again, just kind of a side note. The word behold, when it shows up in the Bible, is a word, it's a clue word that says this is an unexpected, amazing thing. Behold. It's an indication word that this is a part of the story that you don't want to miss. Right here, that Hebrew word shows up when it says Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground had dried up. The flood lasted for 150 days, 5 months. An additional 7.5 months longer for the water to dissipate. Now, here's the thing. When you consider that the water was above the peaks of the mountains, which is what the story tells us, the fact that in 7 months it could dissipate all the way to the point that the ground was dry and solid. Behold, what Noah is telling us is that after everything that had happened, and after everything that he knew, when he opened that up and looked out, what he saw was an amazement to him because it's not what he expected to see. Okay? The dove comes back with an olive leaf. Some translations say olive branch. It's a Hebrew word. It can really mean either thing. So he knows that there's something. But see, an olive tree can survive in pretty mushy ground. So the fact that he found an olive branch meant that the water, to Noah, it meant that the water was low enough that now trees were blossoming. Okay? It wasn't a stick that he brought back. It had leafed out. But when he saw it, the ground was dry. It was solid. And he said, behold. In other words, hey, Mrs. Noah, come look at this. It's dry. The earth has been washed clean, and it's fresh, and it's new. All right, verse 14. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals, and every crawling thing that crawls on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every animal, every crawling thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by their families from the ark. Now, another side note here. That word that is repeated 4 times, everything or every animal, every bird, every crawling thing, that Hebrew word means exactly that. It means that in a year and 10 days, guess what? Not only did Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and his 3 daughter-in-laws survive, not one animal in the ark was lost. There was a supernatural provision of this is a picture of salvation. Even the least of the animals was saved in that ark by the supernatural hand of God. Now, verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every kind of clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Then God blessed Noah and his sons. We'll stop right there. All right, let's talk about the gift of the flood. An actual cataclysm. Did it really occur? One of the interesting things about the flood story is that there is a global flood story in every ancient culture on every continent of the earth. There is something there that was so dramatically significant that every culture in every language has some similar story. This is what I wanted to read because I'd read this years ago, and I found it, and I wanted to read you a summary here. The Chinese language, one of the oldest languages on earth, easily Chinese language, Mandarin in particular, can be traced back at least 5,000 years. Some suggestions are that the Chinese language was birthed as early as 7,000 years ago, 5,000 years BC, essentially. Let me read this summary. The Chinese language, going back into ancient history, is recorded on bones and bronze artifacts. The squarish Chinese characters can become quite complex, made up of several radicals, which are simple individual words with individual meaning that are packed together to create a new word or character. One important example is the Chinese word for ship. When you look at the characters that are pieced together to form the Chinese word for ship, it is made up of 3 individual words that are combined to produce the word ship. Those 3 words are 8-person boat. Thousands of years ago, in the earliest beginnings of the Chinese language, Mandarin typically considered the second most complex language on the planet today, there is embedded in the very language itself the remnants of this story. Let me take it to the next step. The word for ship is made up of the words 8-person boat. 8-person boat. It's a remarkable parallel to the story of the ark that housed 8 persons. But here's what I want you to see. He says some people argue that it's a coincidence that the ancient Chinese word for ship is a mixture of words paralleling the story of the legendary ship Noah's Ark. But he goes on to say, if it's a coincidence, it's even more outrageous than you think. And this is what the author says that I wanted to read to you. He says, to summarize, Chinese history includes a story that says once there was a colossal flood that was so great it covered the mountains, killing all mankind and land-dwelling animals, save for a heroic individual named Noah, who built an ark that housed 8 worshipers. When the flood water finally receded, the ark landed on a mountain, and the 8 individuals on board proceeded to repopulate the earth. Folks, this is not a biblical story. This is from ancient Chinese culture and primitive Chinese language. My point is, quit running scared from the idea that these are make-believe stories. There's legitimate, solid, intellectual foundations for what the Bible teaches. Now, we can believe it because the Bible says it. We don't have to have anything else. But in a world that rejects the Bible as an authority, it's nice to be able to say, well, all right, let me show you some non-biblical, some extra-biblical confirmation, like the Chinese language. Not, by any stretch of the imagination, a Christian culture. That's important. Now, without getting too lost in the flood, there are all kinds of things. The existence of huge collections of fossils, fossils that are often found together in common collections, fossils that by the traditional evolutionary charts should not have existed in the same time frame. The rapid fossilization of delicate parts suggests that rather than animals dying and slowly decaying over time, that they were killed suddenly by a cataclysmic event that encased them in such in mud and in such a way that that when they're discovered, some of the most delicate parts that almost certainly would have decayed in a slow process over time, they've been preserved, which tells us, there's a difference if you let something just sit out until it rots versus something that's been flash frozen. There seems that they were preserved rapidly. We have remarkable instances, for example, of whale fossils. An 80-foot whale in Longhope, California has been discovered on its tail standing up. Well, how in the world could that happen? Polystrate fossils include plants that contain chlorophyll, which has been preserved, again, because of the rapid deposit of silt on top of them. We categorize fossils according to evolutionary theory, moving from simplicity to complex, which prevents us from seeing the remarkable evidence that simple and complex fossils are sometimes in the very same strata of the geological record, something that should not happen if millions of years of time was necessary to move from one form to another. In some places, we have found massive sedimentation, sometimes between 100 and 200 feet thick. The idea is that a tsunami of mud would sweep across the earth until it was captured somewhere. We're told, for example, that erosion is a slow and steady process that allows us to measure time because it follows a very precise time frame. We're told, for example, that the Grand Canyon is the result of the Colorado River carving out the Grand Canyon over massive amounts of time. Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? Have you ever seen the Colorado River? All right. The Colorado River is about this wide. Either the Colorado River was the size of an ocean at some point, or the Grand Canyon would be this wide, really deep. But if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, that's not what we see. And they say, well, it's the slow trajectory of icebergs that come down and break through the. Here's another idea. I watched Mount St. Helens explode in the early 80s. We watched it on television. It was fascinating. Helicopters overhead filming this. You know what we discovered? When when Mount St. Helens and that volcanic eruption was complete, scientists went in and they measured. And the conclusion was, if we hadn't seen it happen, the geological characteristics of Mount St. Helens seem to fit the narrative that this would have been the natural decay of the mountain that would have taken hundreds of thousands of years. But it didn't take hundreds of thousands of years. We watched it happen on television. Here's my point. It comes down to this. We can either believe God or not. And it's not that hard to believe God if you have a parallel admission that mankind overall is not as smart as we think we are. All right? There's lots that you can do in this subject. You can study Pangaea, which is the idea that at some point in ancient history, all the continents were together as one single continent. But in the eruption of the subsurface jet streams that ruptured the Earth's crust, you remember the water fell from above, but it also emerged from below. The idea here is that it's the very kind of geological event that could break a single continent into pieces and begin to let them drift apart. It's interesting to me that scientists today have this theory that we call Pangaea, which is that the continents all used to be a single landmass. Wow, that sounds very biblical to me. The ark, using the idea of a biblical cubit equal to 26 inches, means that the measurements given to us in the Bible, traditionally, it's 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet tall. Modern estimates of the length of a cubit differ a little bit from some of the ancient documents. Modern estimates put that measurement of the ark at 500 feet by 86 feet wide by 52 feet deep. We're talking a massive floating warehouse. No rudder, no keel, a huge box with 3 levels of stalls and rooms sufficient for the creatures that God meant to preserve. The subsurface jet streams ruptured from below, the collapse of a firmament or canopy, the transition of crystal to liquid. You ever wonder why bugs in the Amazonian rainforest are huge? You ever look at that? You ever watch a documentary on the rainforest? What you find out is that their animals are just freakishly big. I mean, ants the size of your hand, spiders the size of your face. I have flown to Brazil, but I stayed in the city. Okay? I am not taking a canoe down the Amazon River. The animals are massive. Why? Because the ecosystem of the Amazonian region is different than any other ecosystem left on the earth. The theory is that the original ecosystem of the earth, with its canopy and the way that it maintained moisture, much like the rainforest does, would have meant that the ability for humans to live extremely long lives, for men of some significant size to be born and to grow. I mean, if you continue to grow, even infinitesimally, and you live 900 years, all of a sudden the stories of 8-foot tall giants are not unreasonable. My point is, the text doesn't tell us all that. But if you want to spend the time looking into it, if you can set aside the evolutionary narrative and try and just examine the evidence, it's fascinatingly consistent with what we are given in the biblical text. Now, what's the foundational truth of this? Well, the foundational truth, remember I said the flood story is a parenthesis. The foundational truth is the hook that keeps the flood story attached to the narrative of God's promises happening through the descendants of Shem. Look in chapter 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah. That's it. God remembered Noah. In the middle of the greatest biblical story of judgment, the main point is about redemption and grace. Now it says that the ark came to rest on a mountain. That in itself is a miracle. Why? Because first of all, to come to rest in the Ararat Mountains. Some people translate it Mount Ararat, but really in the Hebrew, that's why we have to be careful about arguing for certain locations. The Hebrew basically says the Ararat range of mountains. So it doesn't give us a precise location, although there is an area in Turkey where there are suspicions of a massive wooden structure that may be related to the ark. That structure was on a level place. An earthquake happened in 1846, which allowed it to slide down further on the mountain and break into two pieces. So, but the Turkish government is incredibly protective of it. It's not open to just anybody who wants to go see it or scientists who want to go examine it. Is it possible that that's the actual ark? Yes, it's possible. But again, it's not necessary. It doesn't. We don't have to have, once you believe Genesis 1:1, we don't have to have a chip of wood from the ark to make the case that this is a real story. But what's significant is not only that massive boat parked itself in the mountains, but that it parked itself on a sufficiently level space. It's not cockeyed with the animals all trying to, it's flat. It's got a flat bottom. It landed on a flat space. Listen, no keel, no rudder. God was driving that boat. He parked it. From the spot that it landed, its location is central to what became the known world. Access to the Mesopotamian plain from the mountains of Ararat is easy. Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, presents itself on the other side. Syria, Arabia, and Africa are conveniently to the south and southwest. Asia is accessible to the north and the northeast. Europe is approachable through Asia Minor. India is approachable if you go through Mesopotamia. In other words, it landed at the scriptural center from which the nations covered the whole earth according to the biblical account. All right. The gift of the flood, then I've talked about the gift of commitment. This is fascinating. The departure from the confinement of the ark after a year and 10 days shows up here in verse 20. They left the ark in verse 18, and they let all the animals out. Verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every kind of clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This is what's interesting about verse 20. This is the first altar mentioned in the Bible. Somewhere along the way, the altar of sacrifice had already become Noah's understandable way of bringing worship to God. He offered to Yahweh. You see in verse 20. Do you see in your text? It probably says Noah built an altar to the Lord. And if you look at the word Lord, you'll see that it's capital letters. The whole word is capital letters. In the Old Testament, the word Lord is the word Adonai. When you see Lord written with a capital L and lowercase letters, that is an English translation of the word Adonai, Lord, or shepherd is really kind of what that means. When you see the word Lord with all capital letters, that is the Hebrew way of referring to the name of God, Yahweh, a name that they refuse to write out of respect for the word. So every time the name Yahweh shows up in the narrative, it's recorded as Lord, but with all capital letters. Now, the reason that's significant is because, remember, God doesn't actually reveal that personal covenant-keeping name, Yahweh, I am who I am, until we get to the book of Exodus when Moses meets God at the burning bush. Hey, I'm going to go to Egypt. You're sending me to Egypt. They're going to say, what's the name of this God that sent you? And he says, tell them, I am sent you. I am who I am, Yahweh. It comes from the Hebrew word, verb of being, to be. I am who I am. I am who I was. I am who I will be. You can take any tense of that verb to be, and it becomes a comprehensive description of the personal name of God. There's 100 names of God in the Old Testament, but this is the primary name. This is the personal name that God reveals to Moses. So how does it show up in Genesis chapter 8? Well, who wrote Genesis chapter 8? Moses. He simply tells the story, but according to the inspiration that was given to him as an inspired writer of Scripture, he plugs that name in because he's suggesting that when Noah came off the ark, he offered sacrifices to the covenant-keeping, the promise-keeping God who we know now is named Yahweh. All right, here we go. First altar mentioned in Scripture. His first act after disembarking from the ark was not to go build a house. I mean, he's been in the ark for 1 year and 10 days. Mrs. Noah, she's ready for a kitchen. She wants a living room. He'd like to have a den. I mean, there is a house on the horizon. When he said, behold, the land is dry, I promise you, he's thinking it's probably ready to be built on. And yet, a home was not the first thing he built. The first thing he constructed coming off that ark was a place of worship. He offered to Yahweh, the covenant God, and he offered a blending of thanksgiving and propitiation. But here's the thing. Look again. This word means every. Noah built an altar to the ark and took some of every kind of clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. In other words, in the entire Bible, until we get to Jesus on the cross, there is no greater or more extensive offering than what Noah did coming off the ark. He must have offered hundreds of animals in that sacrifice. You say, wow, he kept those animals alive for 1 year just so that he could kill them on a sacrifice first day off the boat. Yes, because that was the divine purpose for their salvation. For their preservation is a better word. The greatest single act of offering or sacrifice in the whole Bible until it is superseded by the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. That's his gift of commitment. So then there's what I've called the gift of constancy. Look at the way this chapter ends. In verse 21 it says, the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. Now that's the first of two promises. We'll read the second one in just a minute. But in verse 21, what God suggests, first of all, he viewed the sacrifice that Noah offered, and he viewed it with complete satisfaction. When did we see sacrifices? This is the first time an altar is mentioned, but it's not the first time a sacrifice has been offered. When did we see God accept a sacrifice? Cain and Abel. He accepted Abel's offering. But think through the language. There's a difference between God accepting Abel's offering as adequate or sufficient and God receiving Noah's offering and having satisfaction. It's as if God drew pleasure. He drew satisfaction from this. And he says, I will never again curse the ground on account of man. In other words, this is the first blessing recorded in Scripture since we left the Garden of Eden. What was the blessing? I will remove forever the threat of another global flood. Why is that a big deal? Because after this event, if God had not made that promise, mankind would have lived in every generation with the fear of another cataclysm hanging over his head. God said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to put them in a position of living in fear of me. I'm going to put them in a position of coming to me because they love me, not because they fear me. That's the first part of this constancy. God says, I'm going to take that threat from over mankind. His lot would have been continual apprehension in every generation. But here's the second part of this. Look at verse 22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. The second part of the blessing of constancy, God said, I'm going to remove permanently the threat of global judgment. But secondly, I'm going to establish regular intervals in creation which will provide stability and peace of mind. In other words, nature's order. We talk about the laws of nature. Here's what the Bible teaches. Nature has no standing order. Nature is kept on an orderly cycle. Seed time and harvest, planting and harvest, cold and hot, sun and moon, summer and winter. God said, I'm going to establish by royal fiat that the creation operates in a way that is dependable, that is measurable, that is constant. Why? So that mankind can learn to live in the earth and live according to the constancy of what I've provided for him. Listen, the laws of nature didn't prevent a global flood. So after the flood, the laws of nature, so-called, left to themselves, would not prevent another flood. What prevents another flood? The promise of God and God's intervention to make creation operate on a systematic, measurable way. We just had an eclipse. It was fascinating, honestly. It was captivating. But the most bizarre thing was the weeks leading up to this eclipse with everybody giving all these panicked interpretations of what it means. It's going to pass over 7 cities named whatever, and it's a message from God. No, that's ridiculous. The Bible is very clear that we are not directed in our lives by the coming and going of the stars and the planets. That's paganism. The thing that we should take away from this event that we called an eclipse is not that there's some mysterious astrological significance to the stars and the planets that somehow determine our fates. What we should take away, we've known the date, the precise minute of that eclipse. We've known it for 100 years. Why? Because creation operates on constancy. God implemented a systematic process so that creation is measurable and understandable. They've told us, you better catch this one because the next one doesn't happen until 2046 or some year. But we know the date of when the next time happens. Why? Because the universe is orderly. It is structured. Not because of some sort of laws that sort of magically fell into place, but because God said, I will not cease to allow creation to be random as long as it is the place that I have established for my creation, mankind. There's one writer that I occasionally read in my studies. Let me just read you his quote. The language is, the book is many decades old, and so the language is a little different than what we use. But let me read you this paragraph. He said, these promises, meaning these two verses in the last part of Genesis chapter 8, these promises were given several thousand years ago. And the unfailing annual fulfillment of the promises all through the centuries forms a striking demonstration of the faithfulness of God. The terms of this covenant refer us to that which is almost universally lost in sight of these days, namely the fact that behind nature's laws is nature's Lord. Men now seek to shut God out of his own creation. We hear so much about the science of farming and the laws of diet that our daily bread and the health of our body are regarded as something that man produces and controls. Our daily bread is a gift, for without the recurring seasons and God's renewal of the face of the earth, man could produce no grain at all, and the recurring of the seasons and the renewal of the earth are the fulfillment of the covenant that God made with Noah. A casual observation of nature's laws reveals the fact that they are not uniform in their operation. Hence, if a divine revelation be eliminated, man possesses no guarantee that the seasons may not radically change or that the earth shall not be destroyed again by a flood. Nature's laws did not prevent the deluge in Noah's day. Why should they prevent a recurrence of it in our day? How blessed for the child of God to turn to the inerrant word and hear his Father say, I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there be any more of a flood to destroy the earth. We get so lost trying to prove that a flood happened that we miss the point of the text, which is that the flood was nothing more than a tool that God used at a particular historical moment to accomplish the continuation of a promise that he made in Genesis chapter 3, that he would provide the seed of the woman to someday bruise the head of the serpent and bring a solution to the human condition which had been irreparably damaged by sin. And God remembered Noah. Folks, don't miss the heart of this passage. It's not about the flood. It's about a God who said, I receive worship, and in return, I give the gift of a platform for life that is based on a constancy which is the very physical reflection of the constancy of my very character. See, in the New Testament, we hear it this way: Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. We are the only major religion in human history that worships a God who is not arbitrary or capricious, who is not random or unpredictable. We worship a God who gave us his word and who keeps his word, and that word can be trusted. That is the story of the ark. Father, thank you for your word, for the incredible lessons to be discovered in this chapter. Father, every chapter, as we move through these early chapters of Genesis, every chapter seems to have even more for us than the chapters before. Continue to teach us. Draw our minds upward to discover the truths here, not to be lost in idle speculations or to run afraid of secular criticisms. Father, thank you for the trustworthiness of your word. We stand there and won't be moved. This is our commitment and our prayer. In Jesus' name.